what happened was that the infection got out of the prison, it got into the guards, it got into the guards' families, and suddenly in a little town of Huntsville, Texas, where you had just clusters of multiple sclerosis and progressive degenerative diseases and all sorts of strange illnesses. And here the Centers for Disease Control is called in and says, just an accident, doesn't mean anything. And Dr. Nicolson, of course, knew some of the doctors that had been his medical students, that they were working for the state, and the bodies of the prisoners who had died of these strange diseases was to be sent to the state, but they weren't. They were sent to military laboratories, and when those doctors began to complain or question what was going on, they died mysteriously. And then Dr. Nicolson, well, if you haven't read his book, Project Daylily, we have it. It's one of the most incredible books. It's written as a fiction, but it's really based upon fact, because I've interviewed many of the characters in the book. And it's the story of, well, you think the Tom Clancy mysteries sound exciting. This puts Tom Clancy to shame. It's really an incredible story, but it's a true story. And I think one of the things that really got to Dr. Nicolson was when his immediate superior, was a retired Air Force colonel, was told Garth he was going to go public and tell about these experiments, and later that morning he was assassinated, killed with 6 bullets in the back of his head, something of the sort. Fascinating stories. You really want to read Project Daylily, but today we're going to be talking about chronic intracellular infection in neurodegenerative diseases, because believe me, ladies and gentlemen, we have epidemics all across America of chronic fatigue. We have Lyme disease, we have fibromyalgia. These are all new diseases. Of course, we have the AIDS epidemic, and millions of Americans are infected, and certainly hundreds of thousands, if not millions, are going to die of these diseases. And these are not accidental. Well, I'm not going to try to steal Professor Garth Nicolson's thunder. I think you'll find this a fascinating insight into one of the more sinister aspects of what's going on today. Please help me welcome Dr. Garth Nicolson.
Well, it's a pleasure being here, and I hope you can hear me in the back. Thanks, Stan. I've really enjoyed being on your radio program the several times that I've been on, and it's been fun for me and hopefully educational for those of you that have heard the program. Today I'm going to cover a little more, well, it's all serious, but a topic that hopefully will strike home to almost everybody in this room. And the reason is now, as Stan mentioned, practically every family has, in the extended form, some occurrence of a neurodegenerative disease or neurobehavioral disease. And I'll be talking about that because we just happen to fall into this from our own research, and I'll give the background of that during my talk. But once we were in it, we realized that this is a problem. It's just, not only is it not going away, it's getting worse and worse and worse, and we have to do something about it. Well, what are neurodegenerative diseases? And they're basically 2 broad categories, and there's a 3rd category that I've added in just for my lecture today. Dementia is a broad category covering a variety of neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's disease, schizophrenia, and the list goes on and on. I'll probably only talk about the first 2 because I just don't have time. And then there are the motor neuron diseases, and most people are well aware of this because in addition to the dementia diseases, the motor neuron diseases are just going through the roof in terms of incidence, and it's amazing how many new cases we're finding all over, and even in areas that hardly had any at all. And examples are multiple sclerosis, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Lou Gehrig's disease, Parkinson's disease, and there are others as well. And developmental disorders. And we got involved in this with our work with the Gulf War veterans' families, and I'll tell you the background on that because it's kind of interesting. Matter of fact, we got involved in all these issues because of our work with veterans. Because now more than ever, veterans are at much higher risk for all these diseases than ever before. In the history of our armed conflicts, we've never seen so many cases of these neurodegenerative diseases. And in their families, we've never seen so many cases of developmental disorders like autism, Asperger's syndrome, attention deficit disorder, and so on. It's just going through the roof. And there has to be an explanation for this. That's what we thought when we got involved in this. We've had articles in magazines like the Freedom magazine that has covered this problem over and over again, and I just wanted to give them a little kick because of their interest in helping veterans and veterans' families. All of you have heard that things like Lou Gehrig's disease or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis is linked to veterans' illnesses. And this, by the way, only started to happen in the first Gulf War to any extent, but it's happened ever since. So every conflict ever since, Bosnia, Gulf War I, Gulf War II, and other deployments around the world are now all of a sudden associated with these neurodegenerative diseases. And not all of them are as publicly known as the ALS problem, but that's publicly known because of a person in Washington at the VA headquarters that essentially spilled the beans on that. What they haven't really talked about are the skyrocketing incidence of cancers and unusual brainstem diseases and so on. And that will come out. It just takes time. Let's go back to Operation Desert Storm, because this is the point of time that we got involved in this. And again, there was a personal involvement. Our stepdaughter served in Desert Storm, and she was a crew chief on a Black Hawk helicopter and involved in the deep insertions into Iraq. So they were taking Special Forces units deep into Iraq. And she came through. She was decorated. She came through it okay, but then about 6 months after she came back, and she was training to be a pilot at that time, her health started to fail, and eventually she had to leave the Army, which was her life goal, was to become a pilot. So she had to give that up, but it worked out okay for her because eventually she wound up in medical school. And I have to tell you, she's graduating this next year from Northwestern University. So she's done a pretty good job. And interestingly enough, she's going into neurology. Well, in Operation Desert Storm, it was supposedly a very successful conflict because there were only about 150 killed in action. But I have to tell you that there's some real dark issues after that. The VA admitted to 1994, and then they stopped releasing any information, that 7,000 had died. And these are mostly young people, the average age less than 25, deployed during the Gulf War. And then an Undersecretary of Defense told me that in 1997 that there were actually 28,000, more than 28,000 dead. And we don't know the figure now, but that's out of about 575,000 deployed. So that's a very high amount, way more than would be expected. You can plot by actuarial tables when the average person should die. And in fact, these were mostly young people, and we saw all kinds of problems in very young people. There are 250,000 or more of these veterans from that particular conflict that are registered with the VA for benefits because of disabilities due to the war. Many of these have Gulf War illness, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But we got also very interested because it looked like the illnesses were spreading to the family members, and that's what I'm going to talk about now, because it's an interesting aspect of the whole story. So there were multiple toxic exposures during the Gulf War, and many of you have probably heard about this, that soldiers and Marines and so on over there were exposed to chemicals, radiologicals, heavy metals, environmental sources such as sand and smoke and oil fumes, and also biological. And we focused on the biological. Why? Because we were interested in this. What we were finding was the family members were starting to get sick after the sick veteran returned home to the family units that they were in. And that could only be because of biological. You can't transfer chemical exposures or radiologic exposures to your family members. It really has to be biological. Now, one of the problems in the emerging illnesses that Dr. Stan talked about, many of these fatiguing illnesses, neurologic illnesses, and so on, we call them emerging because their incidences, they were relatively unheard of, many of these diseases, and now all of a sudden they're major problems. And if you go and talk to, in my case, teaching medical school, talk to the infectious disease people, they have this mindset that infections only cause diseases if you had a very narrow way of thinking about that. Polio caused poliovirus caused polio, influenza virus caused influenza, that kind of thinking. And we realized that it couldn't be that simple because there were other issues involved. There were multiple infections involved, there were multiple genetic susceptibilities involved, the immune system was involved, there were toxic exposures involved in these patients, heavy metals and so on. And these broad exposures tend to fit all these different categories of illnesses that I just mentioned. There's no simple solution and there's no simple answer to what causes the disease. Now in the case of Desert Storm, I mentioned that there were chemical and other environmental exposures, and these could cause chronic effects, and probably over half the individuals that came back and became sick were sick due to these types of chronic exposures. But there were also biological exposures, and I'll show you some evidence for that, not only offensive biological warfare exposures, but some friendly fire exposures that are particularly difficult to deal with. There are acute agents that are used generally as offensive biological warfare agents. Fortunately, the signs and symptoms show up fairly rapidly among people that are exposed, and so they often have very characteristic, if not initially, subsequently, have characteristic signs and symptoms, and their laboratory tests and so on. So we won't even talk about what we call acute agents. I want to talk about the chronic agents because these show up very slowly, usually within 6 months to a year or more after exposure. They're hard to detect. They're hard to pin down in terms of signs and symptoms, which are very nonspecific and so on. And it's this latter case, these chronic infections, that we found were very important. Well, let me first tell you that all the propaganda that there were no biologic weapons used in Gulf War is complete bunk. This was given to me by a Marine colonel who got sick, and his whole family got sick, actually. And he confessed to me that, well, they were under attack, CBW attack from Iraqi Scuds. And this is just a map of the Scud impact sites in one area, around Riyadh Air Force Base in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And there were two types of Scuds that were used. They were the conventional high explosive Scuds, and they're shown here, they're ground bursts, so you see a little ground burst in red, and that's a conventional hit. And then there were the airburst models, which were CBW warheads that are designed to explode a couple thousand feet up in the air and spread the content, so it's a low explosive yield. And the characteristic of these is that they leave a purple cloud behind. And interestingly enough, the purple cloud in the case of the Iraqi Scuds was due to Prussian blue, and 100% of that Prussian blue was made by a company in Boca Raton, Florida, and shipped to the Iraqis when they were nominal allies during the Iran-Iraq War. So you can see all of a sudden this has implications in which we might not want to make this public, that our own forces are being hit by munitions that were actually generated and made here in the United States. Now here's another example that you probably have not heard about. These are biologic weapon sprayers that fit on trucks, and the Iraqis used these. They were made by one of our allies, Italy, and shipped to the Iraqis. And there were about 50 to 60 of these that were found fully deployed in southern Kuwait and Iraq. Fully deployed, that means with their biological weapons. And it was all classified, so there's very little information about what these contained and what they sprayed onto the sand. And essentially they're used to create biological minefields. And some of the Marine units that went through these biological minefields became very sick, and many of them died. And so we're fairly close to Camp Pendleton, so one of the Marine divisions, of course, is located down there. And we were seeing a lot of people that were very sick and spreading illness to their family members. So a lot of our families are actually Marine families that we took care of. Now, we found one particular type of infection in 40 to 45% of the sick veterans, and it's called a mycoplasma, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But this just goes back to how they could have gotten this particular infection. And down on this list, you'll see that I've listed the Italian-made biological weapon sprayers and the Scud-B airburst models, but there were also factories and depots of these biological weapons which were destroyed in the air campaign, and also some of them were blown up after the war by our engineering units. And you've heard about this story as well. Camisea, for example, is one major depot of conventional and unconventional weapons in southern Iraq, which was blown up. And of course, blowing up these biological munitions is not a good idea, because you just blow them up in the air and then the wind spreads them around, and that's exactly what happened. But we have gone back and looked at this in more detail and decided that many of these forces were actually friendly fire. Many of the exposures were friendly fire from the vaccines. And I'll come back and make a case for that, because this is one type of contamination that occurs at fairly low frequency in practically every vaccine. For example, commercial vaccines that are used to inoculate your children. One study has done, looked at this and found that 6% of them were contaminated with mycoplasma. And how could they let this happen? Well, they don't test for these types of infections, unfortunately, and so that's how it could happen. So let's go back and look at some neurodegenerative diseases and ask questions about infections. Could there be an infectious process involved here? And now let me give you a little background on this. Why would we even look for an infection for these types of diseases, which are thought to be completely genetic? Well, it turns out the genetics doesn't fit the disease. There are more and more people getting these diseases than can be explained by simple genetics. And when they start looking at genetic loci, they can't seem to pin down. They've found some hot spots, but they can't seem to pin down a specific gene or group of genes that is strictly related to ALS. So that means there are other things involved. So there are a number of potential things that could be involved as stressors or as etiologic agents or so on. And we'll get back to that, but one of these is, of course, chronic infections. Now, ALS is a progressive, fatal neurodegenerative disease, and it causes degeneration and death of the motor neurons, and it starts here in the midbrain in the back and goes down the spine, and the groups of cells or bundles of nerves start dying, and when they die, they can't come back, and so a person becomes slowly paralyzed. They experience problems of moving, speaking, swallowing, talking, eventually breathing, and that's when they have real problems in terms of survival. So the things that are thought to be involved, excess oxidative stress, and I'll come back to this, what does that mean? Well, that means that somehow the equation in our cell, our biochemistry in our cells are out of whack, and things are getting oxidized, kind of like rust oxidizes steel or iron and renders it useless. These types of chemical reactions can occur inside our cells and also render the machinery in our cells useless as well. There are some neurotransmitter changes, and these things, along with infections, can affect cell death and disease outcome as well. Now, there are no cures for ALS, but as I'll tell you at the end of this, some of the leads that we found allow us to speculate on ways in which patients can be treated, because right now there is no treatment for ALS, so practically anything would be useful. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the types of bacteria and viruses that could be involved in these diseases. Now, most of you know that viruses can't live by themselves. They're tiny little entities that have a little bit of genetic material in them, and they have to get inside a cell to replicate, because they can't replicate on their own outside of cells. But most bacteria can. But there's a class of bacteria, a very primitive class of bacteria, that really can't survive and do well on their own because they've lost most of their genetic material. And an example of this is in the middle, called mycoplasma. But there are other examples as well, and you've heard about some of these, like Lyme disease, Borrelia, for example, chlamydia pneumoniae. We'll come back to that in a moment. But these primitive bacteria really cannot do well on their own. So they have to be inside a cell, a human or animal cell, they don't really care what, and use the machinery and the metabolites of the cell to survive and grow. So what are some of these small primitive bacteria? They're shown over here. You can see that on the left. Mycoplasma, which we'll come back to in a moment. Chlamydia. Rickettsia, which we haven't heard too much about in this country. You hear about it more in Africa and Asia, but believe me, you're going to hear about it a lot more in this country, because not only is it here now, it's exploding in incidence. Brucella, which causes brucellosis, and about 10% of chronic fatigue syndrome patients, by the way, are affected with this particular infection. Borrelia with the Lyme disease, spirochete, which doesn't act on its own, it acts with a number of other co-infections, including mycoplasma rickettsia, and other infections, and I'll come back to that at the end of the talk. Coxiella, there are others. The list is much longer than this. I just put a few up there just to show you. And then there's some viruses that are involved. We'll come back to the virus situation. So we found that there was a very high frequency of mycoplasma infections, both in Gulf War veterans and civilians as well, that had ALS. And we published that. And this is just a copy of the abstract of that study in the Journal of Clinical Neurosciences. The interesting thing was that when we looked at Gulf War veterans, and these are US veterans, British veterans, Canadian veterans, and Australian veterans, we didn't discriminate. 100% had this unusual infection, so we didn't find any veterans with ALS that didn't have the infection. So that told us right away that this was very, very important. And in civilians, we found that about 85 to 90% had the infection, so we think that this may be a major player as well in civilian diseases, so we know that that's important. So if you look at the frequency of this type of infection, mycoplasma, in Gulf War veterans, as I mentioned, 100% had this infection. And then when we started to look at this, it got even more interesting because normally when a person has this type of infection, and a lot of people do, it's a very common infection, there are different types of species of this infection. And often these different species occur in different areas depending upon infections and so on. But we just don't find one species, as I'll show you in a moment. But that's what we found in the case of the Gulf War veterans. Almost all of them, greater than 90%, had this one species, Mycoplasma fermentans. Now that particular species has kind of a checkered past, as I'll come back to in a moment. So that becomes very suspicious, and why all the military have this one species. Then when we started looking at civilians, we found a different situation. Yes, more than 85% of them had mycoplasma, but they also had other things as well. They had viruses like HHV6 at a fairly low percentage. A few of them had, about 15% had chlamydia pneumonia infections. About 25%, that number may grow now, have the Lyme Borrelia infections. So we know that that's of major importance. And here's this unusual virus called an enterovirus, ECO7 enterovirus. So I'm not going to go into detail on that, but this occurs at very high frequency in civilians with ALS, but not in the military personnel. So here's something that's unique to the civilians that is not found in military cases. So there are some differences. Now, in the case of civilians, when we look at the mycoplasma species, yes, we find a lot of mycoplasma fermentans, but we also find these other species as well. And this is just American patients, North American patients, Canadians and US citizens. In Europe, the distribution's a little bit more, different. There are many, much higher percentage of Mycoplasma hominis, for example, in Europeans with ALS. So there are regional differences, just like we find with chronic fatigue syndrome, where Mycoplasma hominis is the most common infection found in chronic fatigue syndrome patients in Europe. But in the United States, it's Mycoplasma pneumoniae, followed by Mycoplasma fermentans. Well, why is this even important? It's important to know the origin of these types of infections because it gives us some insight into what happened. And in the case of the military, the infection was very interesting because we started to pick up some unusual gene sequences in the military version of the infection. It led us to believe that this might in fact be something that was developed in the germ warfare programs. And in fact, the U.S. Army patented this Mycoplasma fermentans, and this is a copy of the patent, patent number 5,242,820 by Shai-Ching Lo, who's at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. And they were studying it here. They mentioned AIDS patients, but they knew a lot more about it. In fact, when we found out, they knew all about it. In fact, they were probably one of the first to find this in Gulf War veterans, but they didn't say anything about it. And they kept it quiet. And then we discovered it. We could have used their help because we were looking at practically everything, chicken soup. And we tended, because of the signs and symptoms, to focus on this. And this Project Daylily, our book, goes into a lot of this scientific mystery that involves these illnesses. But we didn't have any idea that this particular infection might be involved, and they sort of knew it all along, unfortunately. Now let's go back to the neurodegenerative diseases, and we've talked about ALS. How about the other exploding diseases, exploding in incidence in our population? Could they also have a link to these types of unusual infections that we find? Multiple sclerosis, this is a chronic inflammatory demyelinating disease, so that you have a protective sheath around the nerves in areas of the brain that protects it, and unfortunately our immune system, if it's primed to attack this, will actually take the sheath right off the nerves and destroy it. And when that happens, the nerves can't send their signals. It's just like stripping the insulation off a wire. It shorts out, and the nerves short out in multiple sclerosis and causes a lot of problems. So this is a disease. There are different forms of it. Some forms are cycling, for example, and other things. I'm not going to go into the details on it. There are environmental issues involved in MS and genetic issues as well, and including infections, and we've tried to concentrate on some of the infections. And treatments, we'll come back to some of the treatments. So how about multiple sclerosis? Greater than 50% of MS patients have mycoplasma infections. Often they're found to have human herpes virus 6 infections. That's a part of the human herpes virus, but not the type that you find causing skin lesions, for example, subcutaneous lesions. Chlamydia pneumoniae, about 15, maybe even 20%. And Borrelia now, and this is brand new information, maybe as high as 35%. So Borrelia is one of these emerging infections, like the mycoplasma, that we didn't hear about, or was very rare a couple decades or more, 3 decades ago. You hardly ever heard about it. And now all of a sudden it's so common that it's spread across the United States like wildfire. Alzheimer's disease. This is the most common form of dementia, and again we see an explosion of incidence of Alzheimer's disease in our population. And this is mainly causes progressive cognitive deterioration, declining activities, and so on. This turns out to be a major problem, and almost every family, extended family, is now being hit with this. And this is a very complex disease where there are genetics involved. There's also a number of proteins inside the cells which fold up to form neurofibrils in these nerve cells, and they don't fold right. And there are also proteins that are released and get outside the cell and cause problems as well, leading to the formation of plaques and so on. So we know that they're both genetic factors, and there are some oxidative problems, which I'll come back to, that are an issue here. But basically, there's no real cure for Alzheimer's disease, and it's a very nasty problem and very emotional problem for those people that have AD patients and their families. So I've talked about a couple of these in terms of chronic infections. A very high percentage of patients with these diseases like ALS and MS have infections. Well, how about Alzheimer's and Parkinson's? And the answer is yes. They also show a very high incidence of infections. Now, not every disease shows the same infection, but there's some overlap in all these diseases. And what do we make of this? Again, going back to one of the introductory slides, if you're an infectious disease specialist, you say, well, this has got to be all hogwash because there isn't a polio virus causing polio. But that's not how these diseases work. They work in concert with the genetics, with the immune system, with the toxic exposures, heavy metals, chemicals, so on and so forth. So they're very complex, and they can't be explained by just simple infection or simple heavy metal exposure or whatever. It's not so simple. Now, I'm going to come back to autism, so I'm at the end of my talk, so I'm not going to talk about that. It's just that this is a general slide, and I'll just take it as a general point, that the majority of chronic illness patients, whether they have these neurodegenerative diseases, fatiguing illnesses, autoimmune illnesses, and so on, show evidence of chronic infections. Over half, and probably the overwhelming majority of patients have some sort of chronic infection. And most of them have multiple infections. So it's really complex. Now, if these infections are treated, the patients gain benefit from that. It's not generally their only problem, but it's helpful if they have these infections, if they're treated. And in many cases, chronic illness patients can recover from their illness after long-term treatment of their infections. Also, this requires removal of the heavy metals and so on and so forth. So it's not a simple one-on-one process, but certainly if these patients who have chronic infections are not properly treated, in our experience, they won't recover. So no matter what you do, if you have a patient, for example, with Alzheimer's disease, they have these infections, no matter what you do, if you don't treat the infections, they're just not going to recover. It's part of the equation and has to be considered in any treatment paradigm. Now, what do the infections do? And I've tried to simplify this so that everybody can understand this. That when these infections like mycoplasma get inside the cell, they interfere with the metabolism of the cell. They interfere with the little batteries inside our cells called the mitochondria. This is where all the energy is generated. So that's why all these patients have problems of fatigue. All the neurodegenerative patients, all the fatiguing illness patients, of course, because that's how they're defined. But this goes on and on and on. These patients have problems with fatigue because if they have these infections, the infections interfere with the metabolism in the mitochondria, the energy metabolism. And they do that in an interesting way because they release substances that cause oxidation of the membranes of the mitochondria, for example, that become leaky, and then they can't maintain their properties, just like stripping the insulation off a battery. You know what happens if you take the insulation off a battery? It runs down, it shorts out and runs down right away, and you have no electrical charge. Well, inside our organelles and inside our nerves, in the case of nerves transmitting electrical impulse, there are pumps and machinery that have to maintain across the membrane a potential, electrical potential. And that forms the whole basis of their activity. And so if you destroy that by destroying the insulation, then they can't work. These bugs also release toxins that attack the cell in different ways. They compete for metabolites. They actually rob the cell of necessary metabolites that the cell needs, building blocks for their machinery and for their metabolism and so on. And the interesting thing in terms of autoimmune disease is when they're released from cells, they often take a little piece of the cell membrane with them when they escape, and that's shown here with the little red dots. I don't have a pointer, but you can see the little red dots showing that as they're released from the cell, they take a host cell membrane with it, and they can set up an autoimmune response that way. Why? Because we want to respond immunologically against these infections, but when we see that little piece of our own membranes on there, we tend to respond against that as well. And that can set up an autoimmune response where all of a sudden we're responding immunologically against our own cells. So often you have the autoimmune response against the cells that carry the antigen or the infection. So in the case of multiple sclerosis, for example, we're releasing these antigens and we're responding against them and causing the degeneration of our own nerves, the sheath around our own nerves, because the immune response is against those components. Now let's go back to the families of the Gulf War veterans. I mentioned that there was illness in the families. We studied, we're probably the only group that's really studied the immediate family members of the Gulf War veterans, and we found that the adults were coming down with fatiguing illnesses like chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia syndrome, but the children, the young children, were coming down with autism, attention deficit disorder, and so on. So what could that be? We thought it might be the infection. Now the spread of these types of illnesses was not uncommon. In fact, one government study found that 77% of spouses from the Gulf War were showing the same signs and symptoms as the veterans, 65% of the children, co-workers and even healthcare workers, and I don't know how many times I've gotten a quote anonymous unquote call from a physician or nurse or whatever on a Gulf War referral center that have come down sick from taking care of these veterans, and they can't admit to their superiors that they're sick or getting sick, but they're scared, they're worried. In some cases the illness was taken home to their family members in the case of VA physicians. And so they were seeing the same thing as the Gulf War veterans' families, in their own families, so they were very worried about it. Now there were multiple toxic exposures to the Gulf War veterans, but how about the spouses and the children, for example? The only similarity there was in the children, they receive all these multiple vaccines before their school age. Does that have some similarity with the Gulf War veterans? Yes, because the Gulf War veterans, before they were deployed, received as many as 23 to 28 vaccines. In the case of Gulf War veterans, they received these within a 3 or 4 day period. Now, they've improved in the second Gulf War, and they know now that that was a disaster, so they've spaced this out to more like 6 months. So you can see they were planning on the war 6 months before it actually started, because they started immunizing everybody to go to war 6 months before the war actually happened. So they were planning on this. But in the case of the immediate family members, how could this be? And the spouses, for example, why were they getting sick? And this just shows the study that we did. We looked at 110 Gulf War veterans who were sick, and 42% of them had this unusual mycoplasma, for example, and 150 approximately family members. And about half the family members, the adult family members, were coming down with chronic fatigue syndrome or fibromyalgia syndrome, and a very high incidence of mycoplasma infection in those. And actually the incidence is even higher than that if we exclude some of the family members who we think had other types of diseases, as you'll see in just a moment. In the case of the children, very high incidence, they were coming down with autism, but not in the healthy family members. In the Gulf War patients, Gulf War illness patients, so these are the veterans, they had primarily this one infection, Mycoplasma fermentans, so they didn't have all these other infections that we see in civilians. But in the Gulf War, in the civilians, you see all these different Mycoplasma species, which is a normal situation. There are multiple species that seem to be involved, and that's not too important to know what they are. It's just you can see the different colored bars there. You can see the different infections in this North American population. And in the lower part, most of these patients had multiple infections. With just this one class of infection, there were multiple species. That's not what we saw in the family members who came down with essentially the same diagnosis as these chronic fatigue syndrome patients. They had, again, this one species, Mycoplasma fermentans, and they didn't have multiple infections. So this was highly unusual, and it really, I think, confirmed to us that the infection was being passed from the veteran to the spouse, and in case of the children, to the children. This one infection seemed to be the trigger point for this disease process. In the children, a different disease process than in the adults. In the children, behavioral disease. In the adults, primarily fatiguing illnesses, although we did see some other things. So in the case of the Gulf War veterans, they received vaccines, they were exposed to chemicals, anti-nerve agents, and so on. We didn't see that in the family members, but I did mention the children that received the multiple vaccines. So there's a similarity there with the veterans that had multiple vaccines. Not really the same thing with the spouses, although they were getting sick as well. So let's go to the children, because this is our latest area of concentration on how to solve this problem, because autism, as you know, is going through the roof, especially here in California. And these are brain developmental disorders that cause severe impact in thinking, feeling, communication, eye contact, ability to relate to others, repetitive behavior, and so on. It's a very complex type of disease, really requires a psychologist for proper diagnosis. It's seen first in early childhood, and there are different forms of these autistic spectrum disorders. I'm not going to go into details. There's some subtle differerences between these. And there are various things that have been tried, including changes in diet, behavior modification, psychoactive drugs, antioxidants, and so on, chelators to remove heavy metals. None of that seems to be the whole picture. Why? Because not all these patients recover. Some do, but certainly not all. So we started studying these, and our first study to look for infections was a group in Northern California, not this area, further north, where we just looked at a pilot study of 18 autism patients, and we found that 2/3 had mycoplasma of various species, but Mycoplasma fermentans was very prominent. So these are non-military families. These are just civilian family members. And then when we started looking at adult members of the family, we started to pick up that some of the adult members of these families were also sick with some signs and symptoms. Often they didn't complain about it because they were so concerned about their children. But when we got down to it, and we did the illness survey forms and started to look at the adults, and many of them actually had complaints as well. And when we started testing them, many of them were positive as well. And that's published. But again, in the case of the autistic spectrum disorders, there were multiple species that were involved of just this one infection, mycoplasma. And most patients had multiple species of mycoplasma. So what I'm trying to build up is these autism patients have multiple infections. And we published some later, newer information on this in a neurologic journal. I'm not going to get into that. But I just wanted to show you our summary of this, where we looked at about 68 autistic spectrum disorder patients. 58% were positive for mycoplasma. And this resulted in what we call an odds ratio or risk ratio of 13.8, which means that these kids are at risk, 13.8 times the risk of another child in terms of having this type of infection. So that means that this thing is so high compared to, for example, genetic links to autism where the odds ratio is 2 to 3 or something. So this is really through the roof. They also had chlamydia pneumoniae, about 8.5% of these patients. And they had a virus, about 30 of them, HHV6, human herpes virus 6. So it's not just one infection. There are different odds ratios for these depending upon the groups that we use and how they're calculated. And the healthy family members didn't have these infections. Now, I've compared here Texas with California. And I can't remember which is which, but it doesn't matter. It's all the same. In other words, how about another area besides California? Well, in Texas, they're seeing the same thing. They're seeing the same types of infections, slightly different frequencies or prevalence, but the same types of infections. And we get down to the bottom, and we're not quite sure of this figure, and that's the Lyme Borrelia. Why? Because this is so rapidly changing right now that we're not even sure what the true incidence rate is of Lyme Borrelia infections in autistic patients. But we think it's pretty high. We think it's probably high, and it's getting higher. So Lyme disease is not caused by a simple infection, by a tick, for example, biting you. The ticks actually contain multiple infections. The Borrelia you've all heard about probably, and what you haven't heard about is that also these same ticks have mycoplasma as well. So they're carrying the same type of infection that we found in the Gulf War veterans. And a lot of this goes back to the origin, I think, of the Lyme disease. Lyme disease is named after Old Lyme, Connecticut, where supposedly the first cases of Lyme disease were found in the 60s, late 60s. But in fact, the first cases were found on the tip of Long Island, even before that. And what is out on Long Island off the tip? There's a little island called Plum Island, which is a USDA island where they investigate, among other things, tick-borne diseases. And it's interesting that they were experimenting with the same kinds of diseases. The spirochetes, which Lyme disease, Lyme Borrelia is a spirochete, mycoplasma, and some of these other things were being experimented, even outdoor experiments on this island, which is only a bird flight away from Old Lyme, Connecticut, where the first cases of Lyme disease were supposedly documented. Now, the ticks were also carrying other infections as well. I'm not going to go into this. I mentioned Ehrlichia. Now we see why Ehrlichia is increasing in importance in the United States, because it's being carried by ticks. In fact, when we look at ticks, we find all these different types of infections. And the bar here indicates, the bars indicate our experiments, and there's a range to these different infections found in different locations by different investigators. But they find all these infections in ticks, multiple infections. So all these different infections are being carried by the ticks, and when you're bitten by a tick that carries these infections, you're going to get, by and large, multiple infections, not just one. And that's one reason why this disease is so difficult to deal with. And it goes through several phases. There's a first acute phase which then passes, and if it becomes chronic, most physicians, like infectious disease physicians, will dismiss it as not due to the tick bite. But I've got to tell you, it's the same microorganisms that were there before that were found later on. So we think that it does play a very important role in the chronic illnesses. Now, if you look at the Lyme disease patients, they carry, by and large, the same types of infections that are present in the ticks. So they're getting these infections, and then when they become very, very sick, and these are all highly sick, chronic Lyme patients, they have Borrelia burgdorferi. That's how you categorize them as a Lyme patient, but they also have mycoplasma, Ehrlichia, Bartonella, and all these other different things as well. So they have the multiple species. And interestingly enough, when you look at the types of mycoplasma, it's a very high percentage of this unusual mycoplasma fermentans. It is linked with all these military experiments like Stan mentioned, that were present in the prison system in Texas. And we found them in the Gulf War veterans, and now all of a sudden they're popping up in the Lyme disease patients as well. So all the things that are linked by experiments seem to have this unusual infection. So I'm finishing up now, Stan. Don't get too nervous. So the incidence of these chronic infections, such as the mycoplasma, chlamydia, borrelia, is statistically related to various chronic illnesses versus control. So you can actually see a highly significant, statistically significant incidence of these infections in chronic illness patients. And this is the neurologic patients, fatiguing illness patients, autoimmune patients, childhood behavioral patients, and so on. It's highly significant. And the severity of the signs and symptoms in these patients is also statistically linked, in this case to multiple infections. And I won't go into this in detail, but what we found was that the patients that were the sickest had the most infections. It's as simple as that. We could show that statistically, that if you had multiple infections, your chance of having the most severe form of the illness was statistically significant. The onset was related to the transmission of the infection. So in the Gulf War veterans' families, they weren't sick until the veteran came home who had the disease, who had the infection. They passed the infection to the family members, and they became sick. And we've seen this as well in autistic spectrum disorder. After they get the multiple vaccines, all of a sudden there's a latency period, and then the children become sick. And the antimicrobial treatment often results in suppression of these infections and relief in the signs and symptoms, but unless we take a very aggressive stance on here, they can't be defeated that easily. So in neurodegenerative diseases, the majority of these patients show evidence of chronic infections, just like the other diseases that I mentioned. They benefit from treatment of their chronic infections, and along with the other diseases, if they also have heavy metal or chemical contamination or whatever, those have to be treated as well for them to gain benefit. Some of these patients do recover after long-term treatment, particularly at the earliest stage, but at the late stage it's very hard after there's irreversible damage to save patients, for example, with ALS, because there's too much nerve death that's occurred and you can't replace those dead neurons. So that's a problem. We've got to get these patients early on and treat them early on. Treat their infections, their heavy metals, do something about their oxidative stress, nutrition, so on and so forth. So in the case of ALS, what did we come up with? Well, we have to treat the bacterial infections that we know that are there. If they're viral infections, we have to treat those. We have to remove the heavy metals. We have to correct the immune dysfunction in these patients. There's also the mitochondrial dysfunction that I mentioned, the little energy battery inside our cells that have to be corrected. And there are supplements that we've developed to do this, to replace the lipids which are damaged. There are growth factor problems, and those have to be attended to. So now all of a sudden the treatment of these is very, very complex compared to the way they're treated now, which is essentially give them a psychotropic drug or something like that, which is like putting a Band-Aid on the problem. It's not really getting at the root issue that underlies these illnesses. I was going to talk a little bit about this oxidation stress and everything. What is my time here, Stan? Am I out of time?
8 minutes.
Oh, okay. I could talk just a little bit about this. So I mentioned that these little intracellular bacteria get inside the cell and they start working on, for example, the mitochondria. And they release these oxidative substances that damage the membranes of the mitochondria. And so what do we do about that? Well, we have published clinical trials where we've used a lipid supplement that's called NT factor, and this is a lipid supplement that's protected from oxidation, so it's not damaged. It has to be protected. And we've examined different classes of patients, and our studies are too new for these other categories of patients to report to you, although we have been doing some studies, but these are all published so I can relate to you. These 3 studies, one on aging patients, because when you age, you tend to lose mitochondrial function. It's a natural process of aging that the mitochondria get oxidized, they don't function as well. And in fact, by the time you're 80 or more years old, you've probably lost 40 to 45% of your mitochondrial function, just as a natural consequence of aging. So we found in doing what we call analysis of the fatigue functions in these patients that they're fatigued compared to what they should be. And if we add this NT factor, that we can reduce that fatigue in this study by 35%. And then we looked at chronic fatigue, which is a definition for people that are chronically fatigued. And we did another study. These tend to be younger patients than that, so it's not all age-related. But they've lost mitochondrial function due to a variety of reasons. And we saw 41% reduction in fatigue in those patients with this supplement. It's just a dietetic supplement. And in chronic fatigue patients, chronic fatigue syndrome or fibromyalgia syndrome, there was an even greater reduction, 43% reduction in fatigue in these patients with just this one supplement. Now, did this cure these patients? No, because all we were doing was correcting the damage that was being done to the mitochondrial membrane. So they had to keep using this. In fact, I use it every day. I put my father on this, who's 96, a few years ago, and he's done very well on it. So these are things that we have to consider, that our mitochondria are being damaged with time. And here's the mitochondrial function. And this is one of the studies where the mitochondrial function went down about 35 to 40%, and with the supplement, within 60 days or so, the mitochondrial function was back up to where it should be. Okay, so finally, I just wanted to put a little plug for a book, because people asked me, am I going to bring copies of the book? And I brought a dozen or so. I didn't bring too many because I knew that Dr. Stan was going to offer this book as well. But I just brought a few copies to sign for you, because those of you that want a copy of this, I'll be up here at the break and I'll sign them for you. And this is the true story about how we found the Mycoplasma fermentan, a genetic variant of this. It had genetic inserts into this to make it more pathogenic, to make it more survivable, to make it more resistant to dryness, to make, everything that you would do if you wanted to put it in a Scud warhead, for example. And how we found this in Gulf War veterans, but also in the prison system where the tests were being undertaken before the Gulf War, and how they tried to kill us because of this information and so on. But we're still here because we have the protection of a higher power and the special forces who helped us a lot because we helped them. But this is a true story of it. I brought a few copies of the book, so if you'd like to see that, I have this up front. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.